A shoe smaller than a modern phone once decided a woman's future. Not her education, not her dreams, not her voice. A shoe. In imperial China, millions of girls had their feet broken, folded, and wrapped until they formed what people called lotus feet. The ideal size was only 3 inches, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand. But this was not just about beauty. That tiny foot could affect whether a girl married, how her family was judged, and what kind of life she was allowed to have. And the most disturbing part, this was often done by mothers and grandmothers who loved the girl. So why would a family do this to their own child? To understand that, we have to begin in a place that sounds almost like a legend. A palace, a dancer, and a performance that may have changed Chinese history. Pause. The exact origin of foot binding is still debated. One famous story says it began in the 10th century during the Southern Tang dynasty. According to legend, an emperor became fascinated by a dancer named Yao Niang. She supposedly wrapped her feet into a crescent shape and danced on a golden lotus platform. The image was unforgettable. Tiny feet, soft steps, a body that seemed delicate, controlled, almost unreal. Soon, elite women began copying the look. But here is the important part. Historians do not treat this story as proven fact. It may be partly legend. What we do know is that by the Song dynasty, foot binding had become visible among elite women. And over time, what may have started as court fashion became something far more powerful. A beauty standard, a class marker, a marriage requirement, and eventually a system that reached deep into ordinary families. But how did a strange fashion become a lifelong prison? The answer is hidden in the way the foot was changed. Foot binding usually began when a girl was very young, often around 4 to 6 years old. Young enough that her bones were still soft. First, the feet were soaked and cleaned. Toenails were cut short to prevent infection. Then the 4 smaller toes were bent underneath the sole. The arch was forced upward. Long strips of cloth were wrapped tightly around the foot, pulling the toes and heel closer together. The goal was not simply to make the foot look small. The goal was to reshape it. The big toe remained forward. The other toes were crushed under. The arch became unnaturally high. Walking became painful, unstable, and slow. The bandages had to be removed, cleaned, and tightened again and again. If they were too loose, the foot might grow. If they were too tight, infection could spread. Some girls developed ulcers, paralysis, or gangrene. Death was rare, but serious damage was not. And the pain did not end after childhood. A bound foot needed lifelong maintenance. This was not a single event. It was a daily reality. But if the pain was so obvious, why did families continue? Because in many communities, an unbound foot could cost a girl her future. Foot binding became connected to marriage. A girl with tiny feet could be seen as disciplined, feminine, and desirable. A girl with natural feet could be mocked as crude or poor. This created a terrible trap. Parents might not bind their daughter's feet because they hated her. They might do it because they feared she would be rejected. In a society where marriage shaped a woman's security, foot binding became a painful investment. The smaller the feet, the better the marriage prospects were believed to be. But there was another layer. Bound feet changed how women moved. Walking became slower. Distance became harder. A woman with severely bound feet was less able to travel freely. That made foot binding not only a beauty practice, but also a form of social control. It told the world that a woman was refined. It also kept her physically restricted. And yet, the story is more complicated than men forced women and women simply obeyed. Because the people who actually bound the feet were usually women. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts. Women passed the practice down because they lived inside a system that punished girls who refused it. That is what makes foot binding so haunting. It was violence wrapped in love. And it was tradition enforced through fear. But researchers later discovered something that changed the simple story. Foot binding was not only about beauty. It was also tied to work. For a long time, historians believed foot binding survived mainly because it was considered attractive. But researchers later discovered the story was more complicated. In many rural communities, women with bound feet were still expected to work. They spun thread. They wove cloths. They sewed clothing. Some even worked on farms despite the pain. Modern studies suggest foot binding may have helped keep girls focused on domestic textile production, which could contribute to a family's income. In other words, the practice was tied not only to beauty, but also to economics. And that made it even harder to eliminate. Because when tradition, money, marriage, and social status all support the same behavior, change becomes incredibly difficult. But another force may have been even more powerful. Shame. In communities where foot binding was common, having natural feet could become a disadvantage. Girls with unbound feet were sometimes viewed as less refined and less desirable for marriage. Parents feared their daughters would be rejected. So the practice continued generation after generation. Not because everyone liked it, but because many felt they had no choice. This is what makes foot binding so disturbing. No single ruler forced millions of families to do it. Instead, social pressure did the work. Everyone followed the custom because everyone else did. And over time, pain became normal. But not every woman in China experienced foot binding the same way. And that challenges one of the biggest myths about the practice. Many people assume every Chinese woman had bound feet. That isn't true. The practice varied by region, social class, and ethnic group. Some communities never practiced it at all. Others practiced less severe forms. Another misconception is that women with bound feet never worked. Many did. They simply worked through pain and physical limitation. The reality was far more complex than the simple image often shown in history books. And scientists would later uncover evidence that revealed just how dramatically the body had been altered. When researchers examined the remains of women with bound feet, they found clear physical changes inside the skeleton. The bones were reshaped. Weight distribution changed. The structure of the foot adapted to years of unnatural pressure. This confirmed something historians already suspected. Foot binding wasn't simply cosmetic. It permanently changed the body. The silk shoes may have hidden the damage, but the bones preserved the evidence. And those bones tell a story that photographs alone never could. Yet perhaps the most powerful evidence comes from the women who experienced it themselves. During the 20th century, researchers and photographers documented some of the last surviving women with bound feet. Their memories were often complicated. Some spoke about pain. Some expressed regret. Others described it as a normal part of childhood. A few even remembered feeling proud of their tiny feet because society had taught them they were beautiful. Imagine living through that transformation. As a child, you are told suffering will improve your future. Then decades later, society changes and condemns the very thing you endured. Their stories remind us that history is rarely simple. People can be victims of a system while also believing in it. And by the time these women reached old age, the world around them had completely changed. By the late 19th century, opposition to foot binding was growing. Chinese reformers argued that the practice harmed women and weakened society. Anti-foot binding organizations appeared. Education expanded. Attitudes slowly shifted. Government bans helped, but laws alone were not enough. The practice declined because the culture surrounding it changed. Marriage expectations changed. Ideas about women's roles changed. And eventually, the social pressure that had supported foot binding for centuries began to disappear. By the middle of the 20th century, a tradition that had lasted nearly 1,000 years was fading away. But its legacy remains. And it leaves us with a question that reaches far beyond China. It is easy to look at foot binding and ask how anyone could have accepted it. But history suggests a more uncomfortable question. What practices do we accept today simply because they are normal? Foot binding survived because it was connected to beauty, status, tradition, family expectations, and social pressure. People rarely wake up and choose harmful customs. Instead, they inherit them. They adapt to them. They stop questioning them. That is why foot binding remains one of history's most important lessons. Not because it was strange, but because it was normal. And sometimes the most dangerous ideas are the ones that feel completely ordinary. A 3-inch foot was once considered the height of beauty. Families sacrificed comfort, health, and childhood to achieve it. For nearly 1,000 years, millions of girls endured pain because society convinced them it was necessary. Today, lotus shoes sit behind museum glass. Tiny reminders of how powerful culture can be. But perhaps the most important question isn't why foot binding happened. It's whether future generations will look back at some of our own beauty standards with the same disbelief. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring the strangest and most fascinating stories from history, make sure to watch the next video on your screen.